Today's event will involve colleagues from Defra, Natural England and DLUHC, the Department for Levelling Up Housing and Communities. Each panel discussion will have 4 or 5 leads from the list of names here on the screen, so you'll hear a little bit from everyone at some point today. Next slide, please. So I'll kick off now with a little bit of background on Biodiversity Net Gain, but I won't dwell on this too much, as I know a lot of you here today are already quite familiar with the subject. The Biodiversity Net Gain delivers measurable improvements for biodiversity by creating or enhancing habitats in association with development or land use change. Some of you might already be familiar with the diagram here, as it's taken straight from the conduct, but I just wanted to highlight this as a fundamental concept of net gain, the fact that it adds to rather than replaces existing policy and legislation protecting biodiversity. Next slide, please. The biodiversity net gain isn't new. The NPPF has encouraged net gains of biodiversity through policy and planning decisions since 2012, with wording on net gain being strengthened with each update ever since. In 2018, the government's 25-year environment plan set out the ambition to mainstream biodiversity net gain in the planning system. Defra initially consulted on net gain in December 2018, and the policy objectives set out in the government response to this initial consultation remain our core objectives. These include securing positive outcomes for biodiversity, improving the process for developers, and creating better places for local communities. Following the initial consultation response, government announced its intention to mandate biodiversity net gain through the Environment Bill. The bill received royal assent in November 2021, meaning that it's now an Act of Parliament. Biodiversity net gain aligns with several other policy areas and initiatives set out in the 25-year Environment Plan and the Environment Act. Annex A of the conduct explains these links and interdependencies in more detail, but I'd just like to highlight a couple of key ones now: local nature recovery strategies and conservation covenants. Local nature recovery strategies are locally produced spatial planning frameworks for nature, informed by national maps and priorities. Delivery of each local nature recovery strategy will be driven by measures in the Environment Act, including biodiversity net gain. And the biodiversity metric already includes an incentive to deliver habitats in line with local nature recovery strategies. Conservation covenants are a new voluntary and standalone legal mechanism that can secure long-term conservation management obligations, even if the land is sold. We expect this will make them a valuable tool for local authorities and developers to ensure that compensatory habitats created for net gain are maintained in the long term. Next slide, please. So the focus of today's session is the current biodiversity net gain consultation. We're now consulting on the practical and legal implementation details of mandatory biodiversity net gain, both for Town and Country Planning Act developments and to a lesser extent for nationally significant infrastructure projects. The aims of this consultation are to help improve people's understanding of our proposals for biodiversity net gain, give a specific and robust meaning to biodiversity net gain to remove any scope for improper use, and ultimately to use the responses and feedback we receive to help shape secondary legislation, policy, delivery plans and guidance. Ultimately, this is a two-way process, which is why events like this one today are so important. You've got until the 5th of April to submit your responses, and hopefully this event will answer any questions you may have about the consultation, give you a better understanding of biodiversity net gain, and enable you to respond to the consultation in a more meaningful way. Next slide, please. So I'll now set out our broad intentions for the 2-year transition period from royal assent of the Environment Bill to biodiversity net gain becoming mandatory. It's worth noting that any dates I'll mention here are dependent on a number of factors and subject to change. Responses from the current consultation will be used to help develop secondary legislation, which will be laid in 2023. Alongside creation of secondary legislation, we'll be developing a series of guidance documents, which will be made available before mandatory net gain goes live. Some of you may already be familiar with Biodiversity Metric 3, which was launched in July last year. The metric enables users to assess changes in biodiversity value brought about by development or land use change. Release of Biodiversity Metric 3.1 is anticipated in spring this year, followed by a technical consultation on the metric. Responses to this metric consultation will inform further updates to the metric before a final version is released for use with mandatory net gain. We're aiming for the Biodiversity Net Gain site register and statutory credit sales platform to go live in spring 2023. We'll talk more about this when we touch on the relevant consultation sections later this morning. In terms of LPA capacity and funding, a new funding pot of over £4 million was announced on the 11th of January to help planning authorities prepare for mandatory net gain. We're currently working through the detail of funding distribution and when and how it will be delivered. Further information on this will be issued as soon as possible. We know this is something you're eager to hear more on. Local authorities can use the funding to prepare for the introduction of mandatory biodiversity net gain requirements. They could expand their existing ecologist capacity or upskill current ecologists with regards to assessment of planning applications. We believe that individual planning authorities are best placed to decide how to use the funds in the most effective way. So this brings us up to November 23, the point at which biodiversity net gain is expected to become mandatory for Town and Country Planning Act development following a 2-year transition period, in which we hope will have provided planning authorities, developers, practitioners, landowners, and other interested parties with the tools, training, and guidance they need to successfully implement net gain. And it doesn't stop there. We're currently developing a plan for ongoing monitoring and reporting of biodiversity net gain, which will show us whether the policy is working in practice and whether any tweaks are needed. The biodiversity metric will certainly be subject to future updates beyond 2023. We're already discussing what versions 4 and 5 might look like. It's worth noting that the timeframe for NSIPs looks slightly different to this. Again, we'll touch on this later today in the relevant section. I'd like to draw your attention to the big green arrow along the side here, which illustrates that stakeholder engagement will be absolutely key throughout everything I've just mentioned. So Becca's already mentioned the LPA deep dive workshops in March, and we hope many of you will be able to attend these. So hopefully that's helped set the scene for today's workshop. I'll hand over to Rachel and Becky now for an interactive session on readiness.
That's great, thanks Sarah. Okay, so we're just going to ask a couple of polls to just gauge how ready you're feeling for biodiversity net gain becoming mandatory, and also in terms of whether you've read the consultation itself, just to get a bit of a gauge of how things are going. So we've got 2 polls that have come up in the, should hopefully have come up on your screen. If you can't see them, I think if you click on the chat, that should bring them up. But do put a note in the chat if you're having trouble accessing those. So if you could answer those. And then in the chat itself, if you could just please share the top 3 things which you think would help you get. So the question is, on a scale of 1 to 5, how prepared do you feel for mandatory biodiversity net gain starting in late 2023? From 1 being we've got a lot to do, to 5 being ready, we're ready to go, or we're already applying a similar approach. And we'd really like to hear what are the top 3 things that would help you get to a 5. If you could put those in the chat, that would be great, and we'll capture those, and I'll give a little bit more feedback as we get the results of the poll. Okay, that's great. Thanks everybody. We're getting lots of bits and pieces in the chat, which is great. A lot of feedback around resources and specialist in-house expertise, the right skills and knowledge and funding, which we know is definitely something that yeah, is needed. Yeah, and a point here around the sort of 4 million already allocated. And that's yeah, that doesn't allow you to employ an ecologist on that much per LPA. More information and training, advice on what we can be getting on with now, which is great, which is part of what the our project at PAS is working on. So watch this space. Hopefully over the next month we should be getting more up on that, so that's great. And the guidance coming as quickly as possible. Okay, so definitely the key ones here are training, resources, and specialist expertise. Okay, a bit more, some of these flagged a bit more time to transition and understanding what you can do in the transition time. So this is really helpful, thank you. I'm just going to, I think everyone's, oh, a couple more still participating in the poll. I was just going to say, I'm just going to end that and show. Yeah, and also flagging the need for resources for the enforcement and monitoring side of things. So to make sure that BNG actually delivers, recognising the sort of 30-year timeframes for delivery on site. Some feedback around help guidance on the financial value of habitat units would be helpful. Yeah, and a question here around those who are already setting up systems and whether they will work with the new final system, and some clarity around that would be helpful. Okay, right, I'm just going to end the poll so we can see the results of that as well. So a lot of you have read at least the consultation in part, half of you. Some have read it in full, so well done for that. And some of you haven't read it yet, so hopefully this will help you understand what's in it and also help you think about how you will respond. And then, yeah, vast majority are feeling, yeah, still got quite a lot to do in terms of being ready for BNG, so 1s, 2s and 3s. We've got a couple on the end of far end looking like they're much more ready, which is great. Okay. Just double checking. Okay, right, I think this is brilliant. Thank you very much for all your feedback. And just to say, if I don't mention your comment, it doesn't mean that we're ignoring it. We're capturing all of this, and it's the same for all the questions. Do put your questions in, even if we don't come to your questions, you know, we're capturing those, and they'll be part of the feedback to Defra. But also, just, you know, if you've got some particular issues, some particular questions you'd like to answer, please do respond to the consultation, because that's what this is all about. Defra really want to hear from you guys about how it's going to work for you. Just a couple more bits of feedback around just model examples, some also guidance for developers, and just information about sort of specific detailed aspects. So yeah, so we've got things here like sort of model SPD, section 106s, and yeah, the plan is for, as part of the PAS project, we'll be sharing some examples of good ones that are out there at the moment, so hopefully that will help. Okay, right, I think you can carry on putting those in here, and please do put your questions in as well. I think we'll move on now, so I will stop sharing that poll, and I will just close that off. And yeah, I'm going to hand over to Emily to start talking through the consultation.
Thanks, Becky. Yeah, so I'll be providing a brief overview of the contents of the conduct and then going into each part in more detail, and then followed by a panel discussion for each part. So essentially the conduct is split into 3 sections. Each has a list of questions where we ask for your opinion on current policy ideas. So part 1 focuses on defining the scope of the Biodiversity Net Gain requirement for Town and Country Planning Act development, and covers 3 main points. So we've got exemptions, development within statutory designated sites for nature conservation, and then irreplaceable habitats. Part 2 focuses on the BNG requirement for other types of development. So this includes phased development and development subject to subsequent applications, small sites, and then nationally significant infrastructure projects, or NSIPs. Finally, part 3 focuses on how the BNG requirement will be implemented, and is therefore the largest section, covering 8 topics. So we've got the biodiversity gain plan, offsite biodiversity gains, the market for biodiversity units, habitat banking, the biodiversity gain site register, additionality, statutory biodiversity credits, and finally reporting, evaluation and monitoring. Next slide, please. So part 1 covers the scope of the requirement for the biodiversity net gain requirement. So we're aiming to strike a balance between making it suitable for a wide range of developments to address the cumulative small losses in habitat contributing to wildlife declines, but also robust enough to make sure that the losses are properly addressed. So in the conduct, this covers questions 1 to 11. Next slide, please. So first up, we have exemptions, and these are questions 1 to 9 in the conduct. So we're proposing to exempt only the most constrained types of development which do not result in substantive habitat losses. So therefore, we are proposing to exempt developments impacting habitats area below a minimal threshold, household applications, and change of use applications. We're proposing not to exempt brownfield sites which meet a set criteria, temporary permissions, and then developments for which permitted development rights are not applicable due to their location in conservation areas or national parks. We had previously stated that we would exempt brownfield applications, but we've changed our position on this. So just to make it clear that we're proposing not to exempt them in this consultation. Two proposals we're considering to exempt are the creation of biodiversity gain sites and then self-build and custom house building. It's important to note that any exemption for mandatory biodiversity net gain would not prevent planning authorities requiring biodiversity gains to be delivered. So this is sort of down to your discretion whether or not you want them to achieve 10% net gain or not. Secondly, we've got development within statutory designated sites for nature conservation. So this is just question 10 in the conduct. So BNG is required for statutory designated sites and therefore not exempt. Achieving BNG should not be seen or claimed as justification for otherwise unacceptable development on statutory designated sites. Therefore, the BNG requirement would be separate and additional to existing legal policy requirements, and a distinction will need to be made. We think there are benefits to this to ensure these sites can also achieve a net gain and provide an opportunity to go beyond what is required for statutory designated sites, which may result in a no net loss. So building on from that figure that Sarah went through at the beginning, BNG is in addition to existing policy requirements. And finally, irreplaceable habitats. So question 11. As before, irreplaceable habitats are not included within the biodiversity metric calculation, and non-irreplaceable habitats are to remain in the calculation. So if you had a site which had a mixture of irreplaceable and non-irreplaceable, you would include the non-irreplaceable habitats within the calculation and would simply exclude the area of irreplaceable habitat. Planning policy already provides strong protection for these habitats, with the NPPF stating that proposals resulting in the loss of irreplaceable habitats should be refused unless there are totally exceptional reasons. If there are any losses, however, then bespoke compensation for the loss of irreplaceable habitat is still required, although exempt from the BNG requirement. So it's not taking away those protections, it's just considered separately. So that is the summary of part 1. So next slide, please. And I'll just go through who's taking over for the panel discussion. So we've got Sarah, Max, Nick and Heather, who'll be helping out with these topics on part 1.
Lovely, thanks Emily. Okay, so we've had a few questions in, which is great. So just to say, if we'll cover part 1 now, but if you're putting in questions about other parts, we will cover those in due course. Okay, so just really the first question is around the exemptions and what's the reasoning behind exempting self-build and custom build. So if I could maybe ask Sarah to pick that one up to begin with.
Yeah, sure, I can come in on that one. So it's worth saying with all of the exemptions that Emily's just gone through, they're not set in stone. We're sort of presenting our current policy positions, but open to change based on the outcome of the consultation. So please do feed in your responses, particularly on self-build and custom house building. We're suggesting an exemption here because these developments are often very ambitious in their wider sustainability terms. They're also very likely to be small in scale, so they might be subject to other exemptions and process easements, such as the de minimis exemption that Emily touched on as well. Anyone want to add anything on self-build and custom builds?
Nope, doesn't look like it. Thanks, Sarah, that's helpful.
Great.
Brilliant. So another question around, probably around the second part of this, around what about non-statutory sites and whether a minimum threshold should not apply to those. So I would think that potentially that might be for Nick.
Sorry, Becky, can you repeat the question?
So the question is, what about non-statutory sites? Minimum threshold should not apply. I'm assuming that they're referring to, in the question, they're referring maybe to local wildlife sites rather than, SSSIs. I don't know if it's Teresa who's asked that question. I don't know whether you want to clarify, Teresa. the chat there.
Yes, so it was applying to non-statutory local wildlife sites because they can become under threat in semi-urban situations. And if you have a minimum threshold size of, say, I think we worked it out, it could be up to 15 houses is one of your questions in the decon. So you need to, you should exclude, you should make sure that they come in with the necessary BNG calculations. I mean, I know there's other policy associated with that, but it's still a threat.
So I can come in on this briefly. I think it's an interesting point. I think in the de minimis section of the condoc, we do make a point that we don't want to exempt stuff if it's like top quality habitat generally. I don't think, I mean, happy to pick this up separately. I don't think the kind of example thresholds have given us the options for the de minimis size. I think they go up to something like 50 square meters. So I'd be very surprised if it was letting that scale of development happen under a de minimis exemption. I think we're thinking of much smaller than that, at least in terms of consultation proposals. But yeah, it's a good point, and we can consider having non-statutory wildlife sites alongside priority habitats as something that would kind of rule out the de minimis exemption. So thanks for raising it.
Brilliant, thank you very much, Teresa. Okay, so just going through the other questions we've got. Yeah, we've got a point here, just more of a point actually. While I understand the need to exempt smaller householder sites, the majority of loss will be back gardens, which will all contribute to important wildlife corridors, and as a cumulative effect could be devastating to local wildlife. So that's understood. So I think again, if great to put these points in, and we will obviously capture them, but please do feed them back and respond to the consultation, because that's the kind of thing that Defra really want to hear, is around what the issues might be with some of these exemptions. And then a question just around what's the sort of reasoning behind, I guess, having a size threshold. I'm assuming that's in terms of the de minimis side of things. Max, did you want to pick that one up as well?
Yeah, and I can see in the chat there's a bit of discussion around kind of 20 plots for self-build as well.
Yeah.
And so I think there's a bit of uncertainty there generally. I mean, obviously, like the overarching reasoning for a size threshold is that we want net gain to be robust. So we're putting in place quite a few processes and requirements like the biodiversity game plan in order to make it robust. But obviously that makes it a relatively, I mean, it just creates a process to go through. So for the smallest impacts, we don't think that would be proportionate, but we do mean the smallest impacts. So I think on the 20 plots for self-build point, we do, I think, explicitly say in the condoc that we're looking to draft this in a way that doesn't apply to multiple custom build plots. It's really the case where someone is looking to develop a single plot, and we're wondering whether or not it's appropriate to exempt them and are seeking views. Likewise, on the de minimis, I think the kind of area thresholds we've proposed were originally driven certainly by thinking that for things like advertising hoardings and whether it really is a minimum footprint, that just wouldn't be sensible to go through the entire biodiversity net gain approach and condition for them. I think, yeah, we're interested in consultation views essentially as to whether that does need to be a little bit bigger to cover the sort of probably less than one residential unit, but whether it needs to be a bit bigger. But yeah, I think there's going to be a spectrum of views on this, so we'd certainly welcome yours. Yeah,
brilliant. Thanks, Max. Okay, so then we've got a question. So I think you've covered a couple here. I'm just going through. Exemptions. Is there a cut-off date for when a development or permission a development is permitted before that is exempt? For example, a permission approved in November 2021 would still be valid and may not have commenced at November 2023. Would this need to be reconsidered, or does BNG not apply?
I can step in here. Sorry,
yeah.
Becky. I've actually responded in the chat.
Oh, lovely. Thanks, Matt. Sorry, I'm trying to keep track of the question, so that's brilliant. Lovely.
In short, anything granted planning permission before November 23 will not be eligible.
Yes, lovely. Thank you. So basically, it's just anything that has permission after that implementation date, but if it comes in before that, it won't apply. Okay. So there's been some really good comments in here. I'd say a lot of them are comments sort of on the rather than questions. So please, as I said, we'll take those on board. I think one more question I've spotted is, would the exemptions therefore apply to small urban sites? I don't know, Sarah, did you want to pick that one up maybe?
Yeah, so provided they don't fall below that de minimis threshold for habitat impacts, then absolutely.
Lovely, thanks Sarah. I took a swig of water just to do you much quicker. So lovely. Okay, just double checking with my colleague Rachel, is there any that we've missed on this section, do you think?
If I could maybe just butt in quickly on the change of use. So I've seen a few comments on the change of use land potentially having significant habitat impacts. That, like, again, I realise a lot of people haven't read the consultation yet, but we do ask very specifically about that because we're proposing a change of use exemption on the basis that we generally think that would be kind of the proportionate approach, and that typically these applications don't have significant habitat impacts. But if you think there are specific change of use permissions that will have habitat impacts, we'd like to know what those are, so we can take those into account when we're drafting the exemption under that.
Okay, thanks Max. Yeah, so I think it's you know, getting those examples is really helpful. Okay, so I think there was just one other question that I spotted, which is probably not completely related to this, but I think it's worth picking up so we don't miss it. It was just around the 30th of January 2020 baseline date. So just to explain to people who on the call who may not be aware, there is as part of the Environment Act, there is a provision for basically developers sort of reducing the biodiversity value of their site, and there's a baseline date set of when the Environment Act first went in, or the Environment Bill first went before Parliament in January 2020. So there's a question around, will you provide aerial imagery for that date? My understanding is there's going to be sort of further guidance around that and how you can think around that. I don't know, Sarah, do you want to come in on that one and see if there's anything you can add?
I'm not sure that there's any intentions to specifically provide additional aerial imagery. My understanding is that it will be what's available already will be used to determine whether or not that has been adhered to. Max or Nick, is there anything I've missed there?
I'd probably just I mean, there are outside of Net Gain, there are initiatives Defra is looking at to generally improve the state of habitat mapping, which I think would be really important for this through the natural capital and ecosystem assessment and local nature recovery strategies and the like. The other thing to mention is that I don't think we're envisaging that the aerial imaging would have to be precisely on that date. The way the legislation is worded, it would be any degradation since that date. So, so any aerial imagery that shows an intact habitat since then would be a valid piece of evidence to say, actually, there has been some degradation since the state before your planning application. I'd like to have another look at the baseline.
Brilliant, thank you guys. Okay, so I think we'll move on to part 2 now. So I will hand back to Emily and click onto the next slide. There we go. And if you could keep your questions coming in the chat around this one. If you think of things that apply to the other bits, please do add them in and we'll cover them at the end if we have time. Thank you.
Thanks, Becky. So yeah, part 2 sets out how we apply the biodiversity gain objective to different types of development. So these are questions 12 to 27 in the conduct. So next slide, please. So firstly, we have phase development and development subject to subsequent applications. So these are questions 12 and 13 in the conduct. So we understand that flexibility is required to accommodate changes over time, particularly where development is delivered over a long period or where detailed proposals are submitted for approval through reserved matters. Therefore, we understand that there needs to be a method for securing principles around how BNG is delivered when permission is granted, with further approval processes for subsequent applications. There will be additional biodiversity gain information to be submitted with the application, which we propose will consist of a strategy for achieving BNG across the whole site and how this will be delivered on a phase-by-phase basis. So this information would include key principles to be followed, how the BNG delivery will be tracked on a phase-by-phase basis, the approach taken if subsequent phases do not proceed or fail to deliver BNG, that the pre-development biodiversity value would be agreed and used as the basis for agreeing the detailed proposals through subsequent applications pursuant to the approved development, and finally, a mechanism to link the framework plan to subsequent applications. So for any variations to a planning permission, the mandatory net gain condition imposed on the original permission will continue to apply. For any proposals that affect the post-development biodiversity value, the LPA will need to approve a new biodiversity game plan for the proposal. The baseline used should be the same as the baseline previously applied. So small sites, questions 14 to 15. So small sites were kept within the scope of mandatory net gain following the 2018 consultation, but were considered against 4 themes of variation, which we're requesting feedback on in this consultation. So firstly, a potentially longer transitionary period. So one of the key questions we're asking for small sites is, would an extension to the 2-year transition period benefit planning authorities? So your thoughts on that would be really welcome. Secondly, lower percentage targets. So we decided that no change to the 10% net gain requirement for small sites would be necessary. So as small sites make a proportionate contribution to BNG, and we view that introducing a smaller percentage aim, this would introduce more complexity to the process. So the final 2 points covered are covered under simplification of the process. So this involves a simplified metric and extending the transition period as mentioned. So there's currently already a small sites metric available for use, with the aim of being simpler and easier to use for smaller sites. We're also aware of efforts being undertaken to provide services to automate some elements of the tool, and we expect further innovation to minimise burdens for small sites while improving ecological outcomes. And then finally, we've got nationally significant infrastructure projects, or NSIPs. So these are questions 16 to 27 in the condoc. So this was a more recent addition to the Environment Act before achieving royal assent. So because it's a recent addition, the policy proposals aren't quite as detailed as those in the town and country planning section. So consultation on details and wordings for the NSIP requirement is required from our side. So there'll be further engagement on this, as we know there's more work to be done in this area. So in this consultation, we're asking what needs to be different in the approach for NSIPs. So any answers that we get from these will help us define that. So for example, we're currently asking whether there should be any other targeted exemptions just for NSIPs, and we're asking for people's opinions on the transition period length as well. So that is the summary of part 2. So next slide will show who's in this panel discussion.
Apologies, sorry, I'm having some slight tech issues. What is going on? Excuse me, 1 second. There we go. Lovely. Right. Okay, brilliant. Thank you. Okay, so if those on the panel could switch on their cameras, that would be great. People submitted questions before through the Eventbrite registration. So I've got a couple of those related to part 2, which I'll ask first of all. So the first one is around minerals development and whether the metric is going to distinguish between minerals development and other types of development, given the significant biodiversity gains that mineral sites can provide. So I think that actually might come to, rather than someone who's on the panel, helpfully, that might come to Amanda or Nick. But Sarah, I don't know if you want to cover that at all, first of all.
No, I'd probably pass that over to Amanda, Nick, or maybe Max.
Lovely. Okay.
Happy to pick this one up.
Lovely, thanks, Nick. That's great.
Yeah, no, so we think the metric can work for mineral sites. So it includes the kind of full range of habitats that you will find in mineral sites. The question is over the timescales at which it gets applied, because obviously it's a kind of quite long-term phased developments. So we'll be working on some case studies to look at how you could best apply the metric, which will be published alongside metric 3.1. And we're continuing to work with the mineral sector on with the metric as well. But at the moment, we think it can work for the mineral schemes.
Lovely, thanks, Nick. Okay, and then we've got a question about NSIPs. And whether NSIPs will result in a 2-tier system whereby they will not have the same strength or legal requirement to deliver BNG or register BNG sites. So I think if I can come to Max on that one.
Yeah, so there probably will be bits that will have to be different. I don't think we're seeing a kind of radical difference in terms of the strength. I think we both want both requirements to be strong and clear and robust. I think in the consultation, we're leaning towards NSIPs using the same register, or at least a very similar register, and we do see the benefits of both projects having similar requirements in terms of offsite delivery of net gain, because that means that the market can work for both, and we can generally have more opportunities available to both types of development to enhance habitats. So in some ways it will be different because they're two different consenting regimes, and things will have to be a bit different in terms of how things are set up. And it might be that on NSIPs we want more detail provided as part of applications on certain points. But I think overall we're aiming for consistency between the two, not least because it reduces the burden on some consultants and others who are going to be working on both types of projects.
Brilliant, thanks Max. Okay, and just got another question about, or a couple more about NSIPs actually. Will NSIPs proposals also cover development consented by hybrid bills, as well as under the NSIP Planning Act and DCO developments? Are you all right to pick that one as well, Max?
Yeah, so it's a fun and complicated topic, and very happy to pick it up separately. No, so as I understand, the NSIP proposals don't cover hybrid bills, which actually I think derive their consent from Town and Country Planning Act. For hybrid bills, I think it will ultimately be up to the legislation of those hybrid bills, but to some extent I think there will be influence from the Town and Country Planning Act condition on biodiversity net gain. So ultimately it'll be, as always, if Parliament's deciding on the hybrid bill, it would be within their power to also amend the Environment Act and the net gain condition. Obviously it does create a presumption though on new ones coming through.
Brilliant, thanks Max. We're getting lots on NSIPs today. This is probably the same answer, but I'm not sure. What about statutory undertaking developments that are not NSIP, like aqueduct plans and transmission lines? I don't know how many of those would be permitted development actually, but yeah.
I don't know if DLUHC colleagues want to come in. Ultimately, it depends on where they derive the consents from. So if it's permitted development, it's permitted development. We've said that that's exempt from biodiversity net gain. It depends whether the consenting regime is from the Town and Country Planning Act, in which case the condition would usually apply, the net gain condition, or from somewhere else, in which case it might not.
Lovely, thanks Max. Matt, or did you want to come in at all on that one, around sort of those wider?
Nothing more from me to add, sorry.
Excellent. I mean, I know that something that a lot of large organisations are considering. So a lot of large sort of statutory undertakers like Network Rail, National Grid, they have their own in-house targets for BNG anyway. So it may not be that it comes under it statutorily, but they may be doing that by themselves just because of their own sort of corporate targets. So that's worth bearing in mind. And water companies, for example, the Environment Agency have, I'm trying to remember off the top of my head, it may even be a 20% target that the Environment Agency has. Okay, just double checking. Just a question, I'll maybe pick on Becky if she's here actually rather than Max this time, but it's just a question around the monitoring and enforcement of BNG delivery for NSIPs. I don't know if we have any information around how that might work. Is Becky around, or maybe Max pick that up?
I'm not sure Becky is online, and I'm afraid I was actually looking at a question in the chat from Teresa at the time, so apologies. Would you mind repeating the question?
Yeah, just around if we've got any information about the monitoring and enforcement of BNG for NSIPs.
Sure, not a huge amount of detail at the moment. The consultation says that there's essentially quite a long process ahead of us in terms of setting a requirement for NSIPs. We're going to be consulting on the high-level policy through this consultation, and then we'll be writing the biodiversity gain statement, which is sort of akin to a national policy statement for NSIPs, but we'll be talking specifically about biodiversity net gain and the net gain requirement we're applying. That will go into detail on monitoring and enforcement. On the monitoring side, I think we're envisaging at the moment that it would have a similar assumption as the TCPA side of things, in that we want monitoring proposals to be built into any habitat creation or enhancement proposals and submitted to the local planning authority or conservation covenant's responsible body.
Okay, brilliant. Thanks, Max. I've noticed that there's a point around a couple of points in the chat around sort of utility companies, and interestingly, noticing utility companies have started to push permitted development more where we previously required planning permission, which is quite an interesting development. I'm not sure if the new biodiversity duty applies to utility companies, but that's probably going off on a slightly different note. Okay, right, just double checking through. We had a few questions around sort of outline and reserved matters, but I know that Matt's picked up a few of those in the chat, so just keep an eye on the chat if you've asked a question, because some of those have been picked up if they've been covered before. I am just, we've got a very specific question around the use of the metric for phased applications and suburban mosaic. I'm suggesting that perhaps we pick that one up in the chat as well, because it's quite a specific one there. Amanda, I don't know if you were able to spot that one and maybe pick it up in the chat. Just double checking through. I think that is most of the questions for this part, unless any colleagues want to flag any that we've missed. No.
All good, Becky.
Okay, thanks, Rachel. That's great. Okay, so we'll move on to part 3, and thank you very much. Keep your questions coming. Okay, back to Emily.
Thank you, Becky. And finally, part 3 of the conduct, which highlights how the biodiversity net gain requirement will work. So for any development subject to this requirement, it will be necessary to assess and understand the baseline habitats and design options for the site, secure and register off-site habitat enhancement if sufficient BNG cannot be secured on-site, purchase statutory biodiversity credits if off-site enhancement cannot be secured, submit the completed biodiversity gain plan to the planning authorities, and then wait for the plan to be approved before development can commence. So I'll cover each of these points in more detail in each section. But as the largest section, it's questions 28 to 55 in the conduct. So next slide, please. Thank you. So firstly, the biodiversity gain plan, so questions 28 to 29. So our aim is to introduce a consistent format for developers to demonstrate whether BNG has been met and for LPAs to check whether proposals meet that BNG objective. So instead of checking a variety of different templates, the hope is that by introducing a consistent format, it will be easier for LPAs to check whether the BNG requirement has been met, and hopefully will save time. So we'd really value any feedback you have on the template. So this is provided in Annex B of the conduct, and obviously any responses that we get will help us update this to improve it as much as we can. So as part of the template, the biodiversity gain plan must provide information about how the development has taken steps to avoid and minimize impacts. So by following the mitigation hierarchy, which is what the BNG objective promotes. The pre and post development biodiversity value, so obviously assessing the change as a result of the development, any offsite gains, and then finally any statutory credits purchased. So we understand the benefit of getting an idea early on of what is being proposed for BNG and how important this is for LPAs. So we're therefore proposing through secondary legislation that certain core information is required at the planning application stage, and the full and finalised plan is not required until before commencement. This is based on the recognition that certain aspects, such as landscaping, are not fully developed at the planning stages, but hopefully giving you an idea early on. So we're also aiming to produce a more concise version for small sites and also a different template for outline development applications. So next up, we've got off-site biodiversity gains, so questions 30 to 31. So in line with the mitigation hierarchy, off-site gains should only be used when impacts could not be avoided or minimised and on-site gains cannot be achieved. So developers will be able to deliver off-site biodiversity gains on other land holdings or purchase biodiversity units on the market. Off-site gains will be encouraged locally by policy and guidance. Areas outside the local area will be considered if local opportunities are insufficient for the developer. So we'll be publishing further guidance for decision-making for granting permission or approving plans based on the consideration of on-site and local off-site options before being able to look afield for areas of off-site activity outside the local area. We want to minimise delays between the development impacts and the delivery of compensatory habitat. So we propose that compensatory habitat delivery no more than 12 months after discharge of mandatory pre-commencement condition. And although not a policy or requirement, in order to prevent delays in habitat enhancements being delivered, resulting in fewer units being generated and more enhancement being required, we would encourage habitat banking. So this would allow enhancements to be delivered before the development takes place. And finally, offsite gains must be maintained for at least 30 years after the completion of the initial works to create or enhance the habitat. So next up, the market for biodiversity units. So these are questions 32 to 34. So any landowners will be able to create or enhance habitats for the purpose of selling biodiversity units, provided that they meet requirements of the policy and demonstrate that no significant adverse impacts on protected and priority habitats. So planning authorities will also be able to sell biodiversity units from their own land or act as a broker for third-party units. So if, as a planning authority, you choose to participate in the market, you'll be expected to manage any associated conflicts of interest and will need to comply with the same rules and requirements that apply to other biodiversity unit suppliers. So some other things to be aware of in relation to the market as a planning authority. BNG will not enable planning authorities to direct developers to purchase biodiversity units from them in preference to other market suppliers that are able to deliver equivalent or better outcomes. And planning authorities will also not be able to charge developers a general tariff for delivery of offsite gains, which is not associated with specific gain sites that are registered and allocated to the development in question. If a developer exceeds statutory requirement on site, we are minded to allow them to use or sell excess biodiversity units as offsite gains for another development. So this area of land would need to be clearly identified in the biodiversity gain plan. And to facilitate the operation of the biodiversity unit market, our priorities include setting clear regulations and providing guidance, arranging oversight functions to ensure consistent implementation, creating supporting systems if needed, avoiding conflicts of interest in relation to the role of the UK government and other public sector bodies, and finally, establishing an approach to statutory biodiversity credit pricing, sales and investment, which supports and does not conflict with the market. Finally, we do not currently propose to establish a centralised trading platform for biodiversity units or for the UK government to take on other roles which could be performed by the private sector. Next up, habitat banking, so questions 35 to 37. This can help to smooth out supply and demand by completing necessary works to establish the habitat in advance and banking the resulting units so they are available for sale when needed by developers. We recognise the benefits of habitat banking and are considering how the UK government can best support this and how we can provide clarity on the minimum requirements to develop investment plans. A habitat bank would need to be able to record and provide suitable monitoring information to demonstrate that the initial works to create or enhance the habitat had been completed by a given date. So essentially the key questions we're asking here in this consultation are the proposals outlined here sufficient to enable and encourage habitat banking? Next up, we've got the biodiversity gain site register. So this is questions 38 to 43. So this would be a publicly available register of offsite gains with clear criteria in place to ensure sites are providing legitimate gains for biodiversity. So we'd work with stakeholders to design the register to allow local communities to access information on habitat sites being delivered. This would help avoid any double counting of biodiversity units as well. So for offsite gains to be included in a development's gain plan, they must be registered on the biodiversity gain site register and those gains allocated to the specific development in question. To be included on the register, there would be an online application and a register operator will assess whether the application meets that criteria. The key point is that if any development which does not require offsite units as part of the gain plan, they are not required to have an application to the register. So the register operator will determine the application against the set of criteria within a maximum of 28 days. This is based on our best assumption at this stage. Applicants can also appeal a decision if they haven't been accepted onto the register. So the UK government would set a fee for registration and would also impose financial penalties for the provision of false or misleading information. So for this consultation, we'd really welcome any views on whether this strikes the balance between speed and also allowing the register operator sufficient time to review the applications. Next up, additionality, so questions 44 to 47. So additionality is an important principle in compensation. It's defined as a real increase in social value that would not have occurred in the absence of the intervention being appraised. Mandatory biodiversity net gain will be addressed alongside other development and environmental policies, i.e. green infrastructure policies. And we're aware of the current uncertainty about the extent to which enhancements undertaken in response to wider policies, legislation and markets can be counted towards a development's biodiversity net gain calculation. But provided that the enhancements in question meet all other requirements for biodiversity net gain, we're proposing that the following can be used towards biodiversity net gain. So firstly, any measure within the development site boundary. So this can be counted towards biodiversity net gain, provided that the biodiversity metric recognises the uplift in biodiversity value. So this includes on-site measures delivered to comply with a statutory obligation or policy. Secondly, mitigation and compensation measures for protected species. So these can be counted, but should not make up all of a development's biodiversity net gain. The conduct states at least 10% of the gain should be delivered through separate activities which are not required to mitigate or compensate for protected species impacts. So to clarify, we're saying 10%, not 1%. So it's 10% of the overall habitat offering should be from biodiversity net gain. So this is 10% of the gross gain. Sorry, my lights just turned off. So this is 10% of the gross gain rather than 10% of the net gain, which would be 1% gross gain. Thirdly, adequate mitigation and compensation measures for any on-site and indirect impacts on statutory protected sites can also be included in the biodiversity metric calculation, but only when these measures have been agreed with the decision maker. So any losses to protected habitats caused by the development should also be included. Fourthly, actions and measures within river basin management plans can be used to achieve biodiversity net gain. And finally, organisations subject to the NERCAP may generate and sell biodiversity units as well. So we're also considering whether to allow enhancement of the non-designated features of statutory protected sites. However, that we are aware that such an approach might introduce additional complexity. We're also aware that for planning authorities, biodiversity net gain can provide an important source of funding to establish and enhance local wildlife sites and local nature reserves, and propose that we do not interfere with this option and its potential long-term benefits. We're also proposing to combine payments for biodiversity units with other payments for different environmental services from the same parcel of land. This would depend on the different rules for each scheme, and this is something we plan to review and also produce guidance for. So next up, statutory biodiversity credits, so questions 48 to 51. So the purpose of statutory biodiversity credits, so these are the credits sold from the UK government to the developer, is to avoid unreasonable delays in the planning system if developers are unable to deliver net gain on-site, off-site, or by purchasing biodiversity credits on the market. So the UK government expects but cannot guarantee that the market will meet demand for biodiversity units from day one. So therefore, the need for statutory biodiversity credits will be available to developers as a last resort. So developers must be able to demonstrate as part of their net gain plan that they are unable to achieve net gain on-site, off-site, or through purchase of biodiversity credits on the market. So essentially following the mitigation hierarchy that BNG promotes. So further guidance will be published to support decision-making by developers and planning authorities. The UK government will also undertake a credit price review to confirm how the price for statutory biodiversity credits will be set, and an initial credit price will be published in advance of the biodiversity net gain requirement becoming mandatory. So the preference is for developers to purchase credits prior to final approval of the biodiversity gain plan and discharge of the pre-commencement condition. And also any revenue from credit sales will be invested in strategic habitat creation and enhancement that delivers long-term environmental benefits. And then finally, we've got reporting, evaluation and monitoring. So questions 52 to 55. So in the conduct, we've split this into reporting, evaluation and monitoring at the project level, and then also at the policy level. So at the project level, it will be developers reporting on whether habitats are meeting the target condition and reporting this to LPAs. It will be the landowner or developer's responsibility to ensure that monitoring and reporting obligations are fulfilled. So to assist with this, Natural England are working on a standardised process and template for habitat management and monitoring. Any failure to deliver will result in enforcement by the planning authority. So at the policy level, it will then be LPAs reporting to Defra on whether BNG as a policy has been a success. So by knowing early on how it's working on the ground, we're able to tweak things and improve the process. So we've intentionally created opportunities to enable us to refine the policy and legislation in response to evaluation findings from LPAs. So there'll be several biodiversity net gain mechanisms to support on at the policy level. So the Biodiversity Gain Site Register, as previously mentioned, will be able to provide a publicly accessible record of proposed off-site enhancement. Secondly, biodiversity reports published every 5 years by planning authorities. Thirdly, clearer and standardized reporting of habitat losses and gains within gain plans. Then we've got enhancement, monitoring and habitat survey data. And then finally, the annual report on statutory biodiversity credits investment. So that is a summary of how it will work. So I'll pass on for the part 3 panel discussion to answer any of your questions.
Great, thanks Emily, and thanks for your questions. We've got lots there, so we'll try to get through as many of those as we can. We've got a few different people on the panel, so just on there, unfortunately Helen isn't able to join us today, so others on the panel will be picking up, but just so you can see who you've got answering questions. So I think I'll start off with a couple of questions on the biodiversity. Oh, whoops, clicked on the wrong screen there. I've got too many screens going on. A couple of questions on the biodiversity gain plan. So I've got one on, where are we? Scrolling up through my lots of questions. So if I can hand these to Sarah. So there's one around, are local authorities expected to have to check through the submitted Defra metric to make sure the inputted values and assumptions are correct? They're not always in the ones I've seen so far. This is a huge undertaking, and I know a few people in the chat sort of agreed with that question around concerns around those not being correct and how much work that would be. And then there's also a question we had submitted before around the biodiversity gain plans. What if there's a fundamental disagreement between the LPA and the consultant on a submitted metric or BNG plan? Will there be support for LPAs in this event? So Sarah, are you all right to pick those two up?
Yes, I can definitely take the first part of that. So the answer to that is yes, local planning authorities will be responsible for reviewing and approving both the biodiversity gain plan and the completed biodiversity metric. We hope that inclusion of competency requirements for completion of both the plan and the metric will help ensure that they're completed to a reasonable standard and provide some confidence for the LPAs there. And the second bit, I'm not sure on that one. Anyone else want to come in?
Yep, so that was just around support for LPAs in terms of if there's a fundamental disagreement between the LPA and the consultant on the submitted metric and BNG plan.
So the main thing we're doing on that is to try and avoid these situations in the first place. So it means updating the metric and the condition sheets to be as objective as possible, and through things that we've done in the metric in the past, like adding in sort of intermediate condition scores where we knew there were cases where the habitats didn't fit neatly into good or condition or intermediate condition. Ultimately, if they can't, I mean, we're talking about appeals generally and kind of resolution, and so we'll be looking at this in guidance and kind of other processes throughout. So I think it'll be one to keep an eye on the government response and future guidance for. But we are aware of the potential for those kind of situations.
The only thing to add briefly, Becky, on that one as well is we're running training on the metric as well. So we're kind of encouraging people to kind of access that and also interested in views and whether some form of accreditation would be helpful as well in the future.
Yeah, thank you, Nick. That's great. Okay, so I'm just going to move on to a lot of questions around markets and sort of habitat banking. We had quite a few come in before the event around this. I'm going to sort of try and précis some of those. I think there's some questions around particularly, I guess, where smaller developments that can't provide on-site BNG and how that might work in terms of providing it off-site. Questions around what should be charged, how do you develop costings Is there any guidance on the cost to developers of a biodiversity offsetting units that LPAs could charge developers? Can the authority develop a biodiversity bank to channel developer contributions to other sites better suited to management in an urban area? Just some a concern around use of habitat banking at the expense of local contribution to projects. So concerns that sort of local schemes will be more prohibitive. I think that's probably when they refer to habitat banking, perhaps defaulting to the credit scheme. So I'm just looking to see if there's any others around that particular thing. I think that sort of summarises most of them. So I think is Sarah all right to pick those up in Helen's absence?
Sorry, I'll mute there. I might pass over to Max if that's okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, and there was a lot in there, Becky. Are there any kind of points that you think are particularly?
I think one of them is just around. So I think there's can local authorities set up their own schemes, and how do they work out costings in terms of doing that?
Sure. So yes, absolutely. Local authorities are welcome to participate in the market. We want it to be, we want it to work like any other part of the market. So it'd be a proposal to create habitats that would then need to be registered and sold to the developers on a unit by unit basis. In terms of the costings, I mean, it really is very, very habitat and situation dependent, depending on the kind of cost of the land and what's being proposed and how much sort of recreational infrastructure might need to go along with that proposal. So it really does vary very widely. If you're looking to get a kind of ballpark estimate of what we think is happening in the market at the moment, the market analysis that was published alongside the consultation, which there should be a link to on the gov.uk page for the consultation, has some figures in there and talks about the kind of assumptions that are used. I don't know if anyone else wants to flag any other materials that might be useful in terms of costing up habitat proposals.
Just to briefly add on to what Max has said, I think that if entering into the market, think carefully about what your actual costs are and make sure that the kind of price is fully reflective of those, and that's over that 30-year period, including any monitoring and reporting requirements as well. So for local authorities, the clearer and more that's set out, that's helpful for everyone as well, so that can be effectively priced in to their cost. And essentially that will then come down to a negotiation between the landowners and the developers as to what they're going to pay for. But do make sure you're fully recovering any costs associated with the works. And then on the local authorities entering the market, as Max said, absolutely yes, they can. It's just to make sure they are not preferencing themselves against other kind of market participants as well. So it would be on the same basis as others kind of providing sites locally. But yes, local authorities can use their own lands.
Brilliant, yeah, and I know some are already sort of working on the costing side of things. So through the PAS project, we'll try and share as many sort of examples as they come up as well. Okay, right, thanks everyone. So I'm just spotted one more on the offsite. So I think there's a couple, I guess, a little bit broader on the side of offsite and just in terms of the prioritisation of on-site delivery and concerns around, the on-site, particularly created in the residential context, can be impacted on by activities like recreational damage and disturbance and dog fouling. And just a question really around why is on-site being prioritised. I think we had another one around that, but I think it was a similar kind of question. So where off-site provision actually may be better in certain cases. I don't know, maybe Nick, do you want to pick that one up?
Yeah, can kick off and then Max do come in. So on-site was put as a preference in the first instance to achieve two things. A, to avoid the creation of ecological deserts with everyone sort of biodiversity disappearing from particular locations as everyone's looking to do it elsewhere. And secondly, another component of the policy is also to try and ensure and provide people with kind of better access to kind of nature and wildlife as well, and obviously the opportunities that the on-site can provide to do that for incoming residents and existing communities. That being said, there will be circumstances, as the question is alluding to, where issues around disturbance may mean that actually for particular habitat types and on-site isn't ecologically the best outcome. And in that circumstance, you'd potentially be better placed and would suggest to go off-site into strategic locations. But for a lot of biodiversity and a lot of biodiversity outcomes can be successfully integrated into kind of schemes as well. So there's opportunities potentially for both, but consider what's ecologically most appropriate, and it may be that actually offsite is better in some circumstances, or equally because of the nature of the scheme itself, it may mean that they want to go straight offsite anyway.
Brilliant, thanks Nick. Okay, so just scrolling through, it's brilliant. We've had so many questions, but it makes my it's great to have all the feedback and the questions, but it does make my life a little bit complicated. Okay, so I know that some of the questions are being handled in the chat, so do keep an eye on that, because hopefully some of them will have been picked up. Just a question really around the sort of reporting evaluation side of things. So we've covered in the chat, I know, around why it was 30 years rather than in perpetuity, but a question around what do you envisage will happen on the 30th anniversary of a particular biodiversity net gain being put in place? Could it be wiped out or left to degrade? I don't know, Max, are you able to pick that one up?
Sorry, Becca, do you mind repeating the question?
Just in terms of what happens on that 30-year anniversary when BNG, yes.
Sure. So hopefully nothing. The habitat stays in place, and the landowner looks at kind of alternative mechanisms through environmental land management schemes or other things to keep it in place. Obviously, it depends. If you're looking within a development, then you'd expect that whatever landscaping arrangements and management arrangements have been put in place in the longer term also pick up that biodiversity net gain, and we'd want to see that secured with conditions or planning obligations where it's a significant increase in biodiversity that was proposed as part of the development. And we should stress, as we said a lot during the passage of the Environment Act, that that the 30 years is a minimum. We would like to see longer agreements where it's appropriate and agreeable. And there is also something in the Environment Act which isn't given a great amount of coverage in the consultation, which gives government the scope to extend the 30-year minimum in the future based on kind of monitoring and evaluation of the policy and seeing what kind of duration agreements are being set up. So hopefully nothing, and it will also depend to a large extent, which is why it's something I could talk about for a very long time, but we'll spare you most of it. It depends usually on the habitat that's being created. Obviously, if it's woodland being created, then other protections will kick in. Likewise, if it reaches a sort of priority habitat state or a general high quality or a large area, then it'll fall in scope of other things like agricultural EIA. There's a whole host of other protections out there that will apply, and that we need to make landowners aware of when they're coming into these agreements.
And obviously in 30 years time, we'll have such great legislation in place to protect biodiversity just generally, that won't happen. So absolutely. Hey, Max. Okay, great. Okay, so just picking up if there are any other on that. So I think there's just a couple around the sort of enforcement side of things, and particularly where because of the requirement for information years after a site has been completed, and potentially having management companies and who enforcement takes place against, and also particularly if off-site measures are outside a local planning authority area, how that enforcement might work. I think just in relation to that sort of management company question, there's also one around, is there a bond required for on-site BNG management for years? I don't know if, maybe go to Max first, but I don't know if you want to pick on somebody else in the team to pick that one up. Yeah,
so with regard to the kind of section 106, and I think it's getting at whether how you do that for longer distance compensation projects where it's outside the boundaries of the LPA, and so you've got limited enforcement powers. I think where we're looking longer distance, we'd steer people towards conservation covenants, where that isn't an issue, because enforcement would fall to the responsible body of the covenant. So yeah, so I think that's ultimately going to be the answer in a lot of cases. And the second question, apologies, Becky.
So just around management companies and, you know, generally develop the site, but they're not in charge of the sort of long-term management.
So at least initially, we're not looking at kind of prescribing any particular form of payment or financial arrangement for these things. What we do want to happen is that these commitments are all really clearly attached to the site. And so if when proposals are handed over to management companies, the management companies fully understand the requirements on that site and the conditions that are attached. And so essentially know what they're getting into. And we realise that's going to take quite a lot of communication and upskilling in that sector as well.
Okay, thanks, Max.
Becky, just very quickly on Onsite. Natural England, we're very interested in examples of where people feel there's good practice for kind of long-term on-site management as well. So if I could just take an opportunity, if anyone's got local examples, I think actually this works really well. This is a good system. If you could let us know as well, we'd be very interested in that.
Brilliant, yeah, thank you. That's great. Yeah, and you can always contact me if you've got good examples, because they're, you know, really useful for us to share, but also I can pass them on. Okay, just checking through. Just a question around the requirement for offset works to commence no more than 12 months after the discharge of the mandatory pre-commencement BNG condition, and whether that's a feasible timescale and why such a short time frame is being proposed. And really the question is framed around a concern that this could direct developers to the national scheme or other schemes that may not deliver the best outcome locally. So I guess, you know, is there a, you know, you may need more time to get the best scheme in place than 12 months. Sarah or Max, are you able to pick that one up, please?
Yeah, I can make a start. So I think the idea of having a relatively short time frame there is to avoid long delays to delivery of habitats. Especially when there's more enhancement work to be done and increasing the cost. So yeah, we think 12 months is appropriate. We have opened that one up for consultation responses.
So yeah, so it'd be great for people to feedback on that one where you feel that's not appropriate. Okay.
Just to add to that, Becky, as well, the emphasis on habitat banking, I think, is also an important kind of thing to flag, because we are keen to encourage habitat creation in advance as much as possible as well. Again, so that would also helpfully kind of address the concern around time needed to then identify sites. The more there is a kind of pipeline of available sites that are known about, that can also help to kind of minimise that kind of period. And obviously, as sites themselves, they get rewarded through the metric, etc., through advanced habitat creation.
Brilliant. So just sort of picking up on that sort of habitat banking, sort of local scheme side of things, there's a question around which sort of covers additionality, but is also to do with offsite schemes and whether you can match biodiversity net gain funding with other projects. So the person asking said, I think it's important that as it's unlikely that BNG will provide the funding to practically deliver and manage schemes into the long term. And locally, they're looking at a combination of funds to buy a site with one grant and use BNG to then deliver on site. So that covers the sort of additionality side of things. So Max or Nick, I don't know if you want to pick that one up to start with around sort of thoughts on additionality and joining up different funding streams.
Yeah, so additionality gets, as I'm sure you all realise, gets very complicated very quickly and becomes very context specific. I think in principle, we've said we are open to some forms of combinations of funding, at least initially in the net gain market. But I really think it depends what that funding is. If it's, for example, if it was funding from one pot of money that says this is for remediation of derelict land or something, and you do that and you bring it up to kind of structure-free, uncontaminated piece of land, and then you think, what we're going to do with this land, we could use net gain to enhance it. That seems quite sensible and logical to me. If it's about two funds for biodiversity coming together, and it has the effect of basically just subsidising the site's biodiversity enhancements for developers, I think more people would have concerns around additionality. So I think that's what we're going to look at coming up with some guidelines for how the market's going to work there. hopefully that gives kind of good common sense outcomes. That means that we are getting the full ecological outcomes for biodiversity net gain, but that it does allow kind of pragmatic blending where that does help.
Yeah, so if funding's already been received to kind of finance a biodiversity outcome, unless that funding's being repaid through the sale of biodiversity units, then that habitat outcome's already been delivered. There's no additionality. So it's just thinking about what is the additional finance providing, because the net gain monies, as you were saying before, should be costed on the basis they're costing for the full cost associated with that habitat outcome as well. So there's a difference between loan finance and kind of grant finance here as well, which I think is something to kind of draw out.
Okay, thanks, Nick. Just again on the additionality question, I don't know, this might be another one for you, Nick, actually. It's just around, there's a couple of questions, just a bit more clarity around particularly protected species and how to avoid, well, firstly double counting, but also just making sure that there is additionality on that. So I think there's one question is, I've heard that mitigation can be used for no loss but not net gain. I don't quite understand how this works. But also a question around if habitat creation to meet favourable conservation status of European protected species is allowed to be taken into account for BNG up to 90%, how is this additional? So I don't know if you've got any more, just a bit more clarity around how it works with European protected species at all. Nick, do you want to start on that one?
Yeah, sure. So, our advice is that you can include habitat features that are contained within the metric that are being delivered to meet EPS requirements. You can include those as contributions towards your biodiversity net gain outcome as a developer. They could never, in and of themselves, get you to net gain. So you couldn't use this river licensing as an example. You couldn't achieve net gain solely through the ponds or associated habitats that you've created for newts as a requirement of district level licensing. It would be capped at a maximum of no net loss. You wouldn't be able to achieve net gain solely through that. But you could do additional, but it can make a contribution to, and you can deliver kind of additional outcomes over and above that, potentially on the same lands, which would give you, tip you into net gain category. So to use SANG as an example, you could include delivery onto a SANG, provided it was over and above the kind of minimum requirements of the SANG itself, and obviously not in conflict with the purpose of the SANG. So it would need to be a habitat that was a scheme that understood that it was going to need to cope with people out walking their dogs and things like that, and that wasn't going to be detrimental to what was being proposed.
Okay, great, thank you very much. I don't know if anyone else wants to come on that one. I suspect not, but okay, brilliant. So I'm going to move on to a couple of questions on the register that were submitted before today. I know that Tom's been answering questions in the chat, so if you asked a question on the register, do check through, because Tom's answered some of those. So Tom, are you on the call? Just double checking that you're okay to join, because I know.
Yes, I'm here, Becky.
Oh, lovely, thank you. So just a couple that we had submitted before. So one was around the monitoring of registered biodiversity net gain, and the second one is around will the role of third-party brokers be recognised when developing the register, and will they also maintain their own registers?
Yeah, thanks, Becky. So on the monitoring one, that's something which should be dealt with through the legal agreement. So the Environment Act says that can be a conservation covenant or a planning obligation. And one of those two things needs to secure any offsite units for a minimum of 30 years and say who's doing the work, who's maintaining it, and so on. And we intend to set out guidance that it should also cover monitoring. And then that will be enforceable by the planning authority if it's a planning obligation, or the responsible body if it's a conservation covenant. So that should all be enforceable through that. And there's, in the monitoring section in the conduct, we talk about kind of testing ideas on monitoring times, and also Natural England are looking at developing a habitat management monitoring template as well. On the brokers thing, so yeah, I'm aware of quite a lot of private companies who are kind of gearing up in this space to offer services to help users in the system. So the register kind of comes in, the national register comes in at a certain part in the journey, but they're looking at the broader picture sort of before and after. And so there'll probably be a case for where potentially where developers, landowners, local authorities and so on are using services that will then need to kind of interact with the national register, and that'll be the best way to for the things to work together. So yeah, kind of aware of brokers.
Okay, great. Thank you, Tom. That's brilliant. Okay, I'm just double checking. Just a few, I think we've probably covered some of these in terms of long-term monitoring and maintenance. You have, Tom. I guess there are just some questions around how that will be secured, what the requirements will be, and also where it's not delivered, the enforcement side of this. I wonder if it's just worth picking that up for on-site as well as off-site, because obviously you've covered the off-site bit, Tom. I don't know if that's you or whether Sarah wants to pick that up maybe, or possibly even just in terms of covering the sort of condition side of it. We might, I might bring in Matt from DLUHC. Sarah, do you want to come in on that in terms of the securing on-site BNG? Sure, maybe Sarah's struggling a bit with the internet. Max, are you able to come in on that one?
I will, but I'm afraid I moved on to something else, expecting someone else to pick it up. So if you wouldn't mind repeating it, Becky.
I'm doing training on.
It's just around securing BNG on-site rather than off-site. So I think that the plan is that standard conditions are that the Department for Levelling Up is looking at standard conditions.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So the kind of general landscaping, I mean, the bill distinguishes between two types of on-site enhancement, really, the kind of stuff that we would expect to be captured in a net gain metric calculation, but which isn't particularly driving at biodiversity enhancement. So things like verges, amenity planting, and the like. And things which and separately things which constitute significant enhancements of biodiversity on the site. And in the bill, we ask that those significant increases are specifically secured with planning obligations or covenants. Planning obligations, covenants, or conditions for at least 30 years. It's that distinction, and we realise we're going to need to give some clear, ideally quantitative guidance on what significant enhancements on site mean. So that will be coming.
Brilliant, thank you, Max. Okay, great. And just to say that there's been quite a lot in the chat around the additionality, and yeah, Max has said do have a look at the consultation, but we Defra recognises that more guidance is needed on that. Okay, so I think that's it in terms of part 3. I think there's a question around the responsible body for conservation covenants, which I will forget to answer it later, but I can cover that. Just to say that that could be a local authority, it could be a nature conservation organisation, an NGO. It basically that they have to apply to become Secretary of State. But essentially that could be a range of different organisations. I don't know if Defra wants to come in. I thought I could answer it quite well, and then I appear to have waffled rather a lot there. Max, did you want to be a bit
I think
I just the chat on that one as well.
Brilliant, lovely, that's great. Okay, excellent. Okay, I think we'll leave that one then. Okay, great. So we've got quite a few questions that have come in on just general bits and pieces. I'll just flip us over. So I'm going to actually just turn off the slides for a minute so you can see people. And just checking. So there are quite a few points raised about resources. I'll just quickly zip through those. Sarah's already covered a bit around resources and additional burdens at the beginning of this. But perhaps if I just sort of flag the sort of key points that are in. And then I don't know, Kevin, if you're maybe able to just perhaps just come in after me and just sort of say what the position is at the moment from Defra's point of view. So there's a point here around if 4 million has been allocated to support LPAs, that averages as one-off payment of 12,000 per LPA. We won't be able to employ an ecologist on that. How will LPAs fund this on an ongoing basis? What's the plan for new burden payments? What resources are available going forward for LPA enforcement and monitoring? As LPAs are having to QA the metrics submitted, we will also have to QA the developers' monitoring reports to check accuracy. There is a lot of information being sought that would have additional resource implications beyond determination of applications. So, yeah, Kevin, can I invite you to maybe just give sort of Defra's position at the moment on the sort of resourcing side? That would be great.
Yeah, I can answer on the sort of funding and skills aspect. With regard to the £4 million funding that's already been announced, we're working through the detail of exactly how and when that's going to be distributed, and hope to let people know very soon about that. In terms of skills, yeah, we're actively looking at what we can do to help LPAs increase skills, whether that be through training, guidance, accreditation, all those sorts of things. We're certainly working on that and looking at the options. So just to reassure people about that. In terms of future funding, we're looking at what we can provide in addition to the 4 million. Obviously, I understand, can't give any details at this stage, but again, just hope to let people know as soon as we can about that aspect. And that's, yeah, I mean, and also we'll be monitoring what the effect the funding we are giving is having on everything. Yeah, I mean, there's been a lot of comments on this, and we're very aware of the issue, and yeah, we do appreciate all the comments on it. I think that's all I can say at the moment on that. I hope that's helpful.
Brilliant, thanks a lot, Kevin. That's great. Okay, so I'm just dipping through all the other sort of extra questions that we've had. So we had some submitted before the event, so just having a look. So just some questions really around setting higher targets for biodiversity net gain and the evidence needed to do that, so perhaps going to 20%, and also what powers are available prior to firstly to require 10% biodiversity net gain if you don't have that in your local plan, and also prior to the mandatory requirement, and also just the scope around tailoring biodiversity net gain to your own needs and circumstances. So I think that it's either Sarah or Max, if you're able to pick up that one maybe. So it's just around that sort of flexibility in terms of local plans and local policy, really.
I can start and Sarah can chip in. So I think there is flexibility, and we've reiterated the kind of position in this consultation from previous consultations that the planning authorities can, in local policies, add on to biodiversity net gain. If you think a higher percentage net gain is achievable, then include that in your local plan making. Likewise, we think there's scope to, I mean, there are environmental policies beyond biodiversity net gain that will interact with it, things like green infrastructure standards, green space requirements within developments, and that sort of thing, which kind of gives an opportunity to tailor what you want to see from at least on-site components of biodiversity net gain. And there will also be an element to which you can influence the offsite proposals by, I mean, partly through biodiversity net gain itself, also through local nature recovery strategies, setting out what kind of habitats you want to see where locally, and using that to influence what gets proposed by developers and others.
Great, thanks, Max. Okay, so do you want to come in, Nick?
Yeah, just briefly, Becky, just to add to what Max has said, if people, where people are looking to go beyond the kind of minimum 10%, which obviously they're allowed to do through the Act, and it'd be worth thinking about what additional evidence locally might be useful to kind of back that up as well, because although everyone will be expecting to have to do 10%, so there won't be able to any challenge on viability grounds for that. But if you are going beyond, then it will be worth kind of setting out in, well, A, set out in more detail in a local plan, but B, also look at what evidence I think you might want to support that as well. And I know some local authorities are already doing that.
Yeah, so I mean, it's one of the things we're hoping to share through the PAS project. I don't think any local plans have been through basically been adopted with 20% in there to demonstrate the evidence, but I know there's very recently been a SPD that sets out 20% in South Cambridgeshire, so we'll be sharing that, and also just where we get evidence. There's some local plans that are in development that are looking at the 20% and collating evidence at the moment, so we'll share that. What was I going to say? The other thing was just around the viability. I know this has come up, and just how, because BNG is mandatory and it's a legal requirement, developers can't challenge the 10% on viability. That's basically not it's just legally required. Obviously, if you go as a local authority, if you go above the 10% and ask for more than 10%, you may get those challenges. That's really where you need the evidence base around viability and deliverability in terms of that sort of way of thinking. Okay, so just looking. So we have a couple of questions I think are probably for Matt or Laura, just around specifics on the sort of planning side of things. Actually, we've probably covered one of them, which is around, given its status in the Act, with the requirement to secure biodiversity net gain, override the requirement to provide social infrastructure. And basically, where site viability is heavily constrained, basically, that yes, the mandatory requirement does override any non-mandatory requirements. The question then we've got is the conversion of best and most versatile agricultural land encouraged by the biodiversity metric, as this would be contrary to provisions in the MPPF? I don't know, Matt or Laura, if you want to come in on that, and it may be that Manda wants to dip in on the metric side of things and what that covers.
So I'm actually going to pass this one over to Nick, who I understand from the answer is no, but I'm sure Nick will be able to explain a little more about that.
Yeah, thanks,
Yeah, so the metric obviously includes all habitat types within it, including agricultural lands as well. But it's an accounting tool, and it's being used for the purposes of biodiversity net gain, but you could equally use it for the purposes of just kind of measuring and valuing your estate in terms of its biodiversity value. It and the net gain requirement doesn't in any way, I think, change our kind of existing kind of protection or kind of practices around the most valuable land. It certainly isn't intended to, and I can't see how it would be driving kind of development towards the kind of most productive agricultural lands. If anything, most landowners are looking at elements of their estate where actually they're not getting much of a kind of financial return through from agricultural products for it, and are looking at kind of those aspects of their estates as to where there may be other opportunities to supplement an income. So the bits of the estate that are particularly productive tends to be the ones that people are looking at. So we don't see this as being an issue at all. I don't know if others want to comment on that. But,
no, I agree. It's a wider planning policy point. It's something that local plan alongside biodiversity net gain should be, well, a national planning policy does. Big protections for those most versatile agricultural lands. So yeah, I agree with Nick's point. I don't think the metric does. It's impartial to the quality of that agricultural land. It's looking just at the biodiversity.
Yeah, thank you guys, that's great. Okay, just clicking through to see. So I know that a lot of these questions have been answered in the chat, so do keep an eye on that. So that's really good. I just wanted to flag there was a particular question around urban street tree planting, which Amanda's answered in the chat to say that there is guidance in the metric around urban street trees, so they are covered. So and there's a question around collective green space being lost through paving over gardens to make way for parking. Could this issue be looked at? I mean, I think that's again comes into that sort of wider planning policy. I think that certain local authorities do have planning policy around loss of front gardens and things. So yeah, I think that's not really for biodiversity net gain. I don't know if anyone else wants to come in on that, but I would say it's probably beyond the scope of this work.
The only thing I would say is just in terms of new developments, obviously gardens are part of the kind of biodiversity metric as well. So so there are kind of incentives to include both gardens, but also other kind of green infrastructure type features within developments, because again, you know, they have some value within the metric.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, and yeah, a lot of comments about sort of other bits and pieces which are really helpful, so that's really great. I'm just looking, there's quite a long question here, I'm just trying to get to the bottom. Yeah, just a query really around concern, perhaps more of a point rather than, I don't know whether anyone will be able to sort of come back on it, but I guess it's worth raising around the setup of having a local scheme and how proposals requiring a site to be registered beforehand and the 12-month requirement to find a site may make that difficult, and a concern around that. Just what and why is it being set up in that way, given there are a lot of local authorities already operating that sort of scheme successfully or plan to do so imminently. I mean, that may be more of a point to come up. I would definitely encourage local authorities to bring up that point, and where you have successful schemes to provide those examples in the consultation response. But I don't know whether anyone from Defra or Natural England wants to sort of come in on that side. Max? Oh, Tom.
Yeah, Tom.
Happy to come in, Becky. Yeah, I think Amanda's put a useful answer in the chat already. Brilliant. But I think just to clarify, so the 12 months thing is about works starting once the impact of on development site has happened. It's not about time to set up a scheme. So you could be setting up a scheme now, have it already ready, so that by the time the development started, the on-site works has already started before that happens. And in fact, if you do that enough in advance, and the metric incentivizes that by generating more units as well. So hopefully that helps answer the question.
Yeah, great. Did anyone else want to come in on that one? Nick?
I think the point probably has been already made, but it is fundamentally, it's there to minimise the lag between a kind of a loss of biodiversity and the provision of habitats to you know, kind of eventually deliver a gain in as well. And we want to avoid situations, and ultimately the metric will begin to penalise if there is a significant delay. So in the same way as Tom described, actually the metric rewards early habitat creation. If there's a significant delay, the metric will begin to penalise that in terms of the amount of units you generate, because you've had a period of time when there has been an absence of habitats compared to the habitats that were lost or impacted by the development in the first place. So the more people can be thinking now about whether there are local opportunities and whether there are sites that are available that will be ready and come on stream for when mandatory net gain comes in. And then the metric will reward that as well, because work will have started, so they generate extra units as Tom described.
Okay, great. Thanks, Nick. That's brilliant. Okay, and just I think a final question that takes us back to part one. Will householder applications be required to provide biodiversity net gain? And if so, would driveways be considered in such applications? And the consultation says those won't be covered. Correct on that? Yes. Yeah. So hopefully that one's covered. Okay, I think that is. I know that I would have missed some questions, and obviously some of them are just not just points, but very, very valid points. So those have been captured. So I'll just double check with Rachel and others in case there's anything key that I've missed. But I think otherwise we'll move on.
If I could just, sorry,
yeah,
Rachel, if I could just come in on one point, just because I think it to expand on something Nick said earlier, kind of discussion around domestic curtilages within calculations. I think there's an earlier point around going into gardens. And
oh, we're losing you a little bit, Max, on the audio, or I am anyway. It might be my end.
I'll press on chat if you can't hear me. Essentially, I think that's the reason we do give curtilages in gardens a relatively low score in the metric. It's because we recognise that while some will be wildlife havens, Some will be relatively ecological deserts. So we want to make an average that has a low score. When I was talking about that, the fact that we only want significant enhancements on site to be secured explicitly with obligations, covenants, or conditions, I think we're going to be suggesting that won't include gardens, because we recognise there's no enforcement mechanism to change what people want to do with their gardens, and it's not something we really want to bring in with biodiversity net gain.
Brilliant, thanks, Max. That's great. Okay, Rachel, was there anything I've missed, or shall we move on now?
Just the question about, unless I've missed that you've responded to it, what happens if a scheme doesn't get registered for the 12-month deadline? Does the developer then have to provide funds into Habitat Bank, or do they avoid having to contribute?
Okay.
I was just typing a response to that one. I think it's on the same one we've just got. So there's no kind of deadline for registration. The deadline for registration is that a site has to be registered before it can be which is submitted to a local planning authority. That's kind of what drives registration. Once a game plan's approved, we're suggesting that people have then. Oh, people hear me still?
Yeah, it's just dipping in and out for some reason.
Sorry.
No.
I'll turn camera off and just see if that helps at all. Once a game plan's been approved, we're suggesting that works then need to start within 12 months of that approval. That's the 12 months we're talking about, and the reason for that is that if that doesn't happen, then the metric will be incorrect, because there'll be a lag between impact and compensation starting. So I think in most cases, in the ideal scenario, is that offsite works or offsetting works happen before the impact, before the development takes place, before the game plan's approved, which is absolutely fine. And the registration can happen at a later date. Hopefully that clears things up a little bit if you heard any of that at all.
Yeah, no, we got you then, Tom. Thank you. That's great. Okay, brilliant. All right, well, I'll just going to share my screen again to finish this off. Where are we? Let me get the right thing. Let me see if this works. Come on. There we go. Right, hopefully you can see a slide. Okay, so just to flag that Natural England are looking for volunteers for their research into the digital services that accompany Biodiversity Net Gain. So they're developing a register, the service for the National Credit Scheme, and also looking at digital work relating to the metric. Obviously you can't complete the form and click on there. I don't think that works anyway, but there are links there to a couple of the blog, but if you just Google Biodiversity Net Gain digital services blog Natural England, that should come up. And also to there's an email address there if you're interested in getting involved. And what I'll do is after the event, when I share the recording, I'll put these details in there as well. So just to flag that if you're interested in getting involved, it'd be really good. I know they're looking for more local authorities to get involved, to develop those, to make sure they're as user friendly for all users, and to really understand how you're going to be looking at that from your perspective. So please, I'd encourage you to get involved. Just in terms of next steps, so as I said at the beginning, we're going to be running topic focused events next month, so watch this space for those. They will be very much based on the sort of key topics that have come up here that we feel would be helpful to have a bit of a deep dive. They're going to be much more cameras on, everybody having a chat, so unfortunately they will be sort of more limited in terms of space, but yeah, we'll let you know about those, and hopefully some of you guys can come along and contribute to those. That would be brilliant. We have got frequently asked questions on our website, and we will be adding to those based on the questions we've been getting through these events, so keep an eye on those. We are providing ongoing support, so we've got a project, Defra funded project that this is part of, helping local authorities get ready for Biodiversity Net Gain. So we will be yeah, I'll run through a little bit more on that in a second. We'd love to have your feedback. I will be sending a electronic feedback, a very short feedback survey after today's event, which we'd love you to fill in, but just to get a quick gauge, there's a feedback poll just come up on your screen, hopefully. So yeah, it'd be really great if you can fill that in. It's really helpful for us to understand how we can do these events and how we can make them useful for you, but also in terms of just evaluation of our project. And don't forget to respond to the consultation. You've made some really excellent points, which I know will be really, really valuable in considering how this new approach gets implemented. And yeah, really great if you can respond. It closes on the 5th of April. Please share your examples of how this can, you know, the issues you can see, but also how you've seen it work in places. That would be great. Okay, and just in terms of, I just wanted to run through quickly what we're doing. So we ran some workshops back last summer, and the outputs of those are available on our website. We've got a write-up of those. We've also got the slides from them and the sort of first bit of a presentation, which gives a bit of an overview of Biodiversity Net Gain and what's happening with it. So you can access those from our website. We also we hosted a Natural England biodiversity metric training session back in October. Again, the recording of that is on our website. We're running these events, and we will be sharing a recording soon afterwards, so you can share that with colleagues. We already have, as was flagged very early on in the chat, so thank you to the person that flagged that, we have a discussion forum, and Paz has a discussion forum, and we've got a thread on that around environmental planning, which includes biodiversity net gain, and we'd really encourage people to get on that and to discuss and sort of share issues and share examples. We also have an advisory group, an officer advisory group for this project. If you're interested in joining, please do email me. We're developing a web-based resource centre on biodiversity net gain. We've already got our frequently asked questions, but we're going to be covering some more stuff around the journey to biodiversity net gain, so preparing for 2023 and what you can do now. And that's covering things including governance and embedding across councils, but also the policy development, management and delivery side, so what we already know. And we'll also be sharing examples and case studies as part of that, so you know, good examples of local policies, SPDs, etc. So if you have some good examples and case studies, please do share those, because I'd love to hear more on them. Okay, so that's it for today, and thank you all so much for your contributions. We will be, you know, any questions we haven't answered today, they're all being clocked, so don't assume that they've been left. Yes, thank you very much for joining, and I will see some of you very soon.